First of all, what is a cover crop? Well, just like the name says, a cover crop is something that you plant simply for the purpose of making the soil not be bare. Just like deep mulch, the benefit of planting something in the soil versus leaving it bare, even in the non growing months, is to prevent erosion, weed seed germination, and to continue feeding that life underneath the soil by keeping a living root system. Even the commercially farmed fields all around us will typically put some type of cover crop, usually winter wheat, into their fields after they harvest their corn or their beans for the year. In addition to feeding the soil and adding organic matter back into it, certain crops are able to replenish the soil of certain nutrients that it is lacking or that may have used up in the previous growing season. The first several years of my gardening journey, I definitely felt very intimidated by the idea of using a cover crop. And it wasn't until I visited a friend's garden and saw really how simple it was that I started using them. I started on a plot that I knew needed a lot of improvement in our soil. I've shared about it before. It's our crop garden. It's just super compact and sandy over there. So, for the last few years, I've been experimenting with different cover crops, both during the growing season and during the off season or the winter time, just to kind of see how they affect the soil and what kind of impact they can make. There are a wide variety of different crops that you can choose to use for your cover crop. There are some that are better for cold weather. There are some that are better for kind of mid growing season in the warmer months. The most popular ones by far are field peas, annual rye, hairy vetch, winter wheat, oats, barley, sunflowers, turnips, radishes, buckwheat. There's others, but these are just kind of the main ones and the ones that I have spent time playing around with the last few years. So, when do you plant a cover crop? It's definitely more common to have them be planted during the off season or when you're not primarily growing in the space, but you can plant them any time of year. It's better to plant something than to leave the area where you've harvested something just completely bare and have it be taken over by weeds. The biggest thing that you need to consider is the length of time for whatever crop you're planting to get to its point of maturity, and factor that into when you want to utilize that bed for your actual main crop planting. So, for example, do not put a cover crop in that's going to take 60 days to get to the point of maturity if you want to plant something in there in 2 weeks. It would be better to just cover that bed with something else like mulch or a tarp to keep the weeds down for those shorter periods of time. The other thing to consider is that if you are going to plant a warm weather crop, you need to make sure that it has enough time before your frost sets in to really grow to a point of being beneficial. So, for example, I will typically plant something like buckwheat into my onion or garlic beds if I don't have something else to plant in them after they've been harvested in July, early August. And that gives it about the perfect amount of time to grow before our first frost, which is the end of September. The great thing about buckwheat is that the flowers it sets will help to attract additional pollinators later on in the season. And then when the frost does come, it kills it off and just kind of knocks it back to be a mulch already in place and keeping my beds covered for the wintertime. Another crop that I really love is annual rye. It's super inexpensive and I can basically plant it anytime. I have planted rye as late as end of November, which is a good 6 to 8 weeks after our first frost. And it might only grow an inch or two, if it even germinates at all, before the snow comes and covers it. But as soon as spring comes, that rye will jump up and it will be 2, sometimes 3 feet tall. And I love that because what it does is that it keeps the beds that I want to plant my warm season crops in, like my tomatoes or my peppers, it keeps them weed free in the early springtime, and I don't have to stress about keeping them managed while I'm trying to prep all of my other cold weather spaces. Your garden plot that I mentioned, I've been experimenting with cover crops on, has super compacted soil. And my favorite cover crop that I've been using over there has actually been sunflowers. So for the first few years, I have been putting in just 50 by 50 patches of regular black oil sunflower seeds that you buy as like bird feed from the feed store. And sunflowers get that really big, heavy root ball, which is great for compacted soil. It really helps to break it up. But the other benefit is that it attracts pollinators. And once the sunflowers die back and they're dried up, we can harvest those as supplemental feed for our chickens, for our pigs, or even our cows will eat them. Also, sunflower fields are just beautiful to look at. Highly recommend. So, what are some of the concerns with cover crops? One of the hesitations I held initially for planting a cover crop was how I would terminate it when I was ready to plant in that space. I am completely no-till gardening here, so I couldn't just run through the tiller to chop it up into pieces and prep my beds. Planting something with a lot of mass in a space is kind of scary sounding, especially when you've worked so hard to eliminate all of the grasses and weeds in an area for several years. And there are some crops that I mentioned, they'll die off with the frost. So buckwheat, oats, those, if you plant them thick and you time it correctly, they are just perfect because they die right in place and cover your beds with a nice thick layer of mulch. And you don't have to worry about it. As long as you're timing it so that they don't go to seed, they will die off. And you don't have to worry about fighting with them coming back. They'll just leave a nice thick mulch in your bed, and you can plant right into that the next season. Other things like the rye, they are not going to die back with any cooler temperatures. We've used a couple different methods to get rid of our rye in the past. Some people will mow it down with a lawnmower or a weed whacker. I have also flipped my beds. So basically just dug up a little piece at a time and put it upside down and killed it off just like you would if you were double digging. Probably my preference for killing rye or other cold weather crops is to tarp them for a period of time. So I will kind of think a month ahead in the springtime when I'm getting ready to need to use those beds for my warm weather crops, and I will throw my big tarp over it and just let it die from no sunlight or watering. And again, that just leaves a nice mulchy bed for me to plant in. A couple additional tips for having success with cover crops. Number one, you do not have to be monocropping. So you can do a mixture of peas and oats and rye and radishes. Another tip I've learned is that it's really nice if you can start with a completely clear weed-free bed so that your cover crop seeds are not having to compete with something else in that area. So you can tarp your bed, you can flame weed it, you can cover it with an extra scrap of landscape fabric or cardboard, but covering it for a week or two just to kind of give it that baseline is super helpful for it to be successful. I do not have any fancy way that I seed my cover crops. I just simply broadcast them, which is just scooping a handful and tossing out, trying to spread it evenly. Sometimes if I have germination that's kind of spotty, I'll go back and I will spread another little layer in the spots that are patchy. I don't even rake them in or cover them with soil. Just make sure that you're watering them pretty consistently for the first week or until they germinate. The last question that I get asked all the time is it beneficial to use cover crops in small growing spaces? Well, I don't know that I would put cover crop in like a single pot. There's definitely benefits to using it in a raised bed or a 10 by 10 in-ground plot. For all the same reason it's beneficial to use it in a larger plot. Soil in any quantity or container can still benefit. I hope this was a helpful just introduction to cover crops. I could go a lot deeper about them, but my biggest suggestion would just be kind of look at your garden space right now. Do you have something that is kind of an empty spot where you know, had to pull up some bolted lettuce or your garlic? If you're not going to succession plant a new crop in that space, what can you cover it with? You can mulch it, you could tarp it, or you could go buy a bag of buckwheat or peas and throw them in and see what happens. See if you notice any differences. It's super inexpensive, and honestly, it's nice just to have something else green growing there that's not weeds. Thanks for watching. Talk to you guys later.